Hi, I'm Dr. Rich Plana, and welcome to the course. In this session, session 2, we're going to talk about sex. And because there's so much to cover when we talk about sex, I'm going to break it down into 5 lectures. In this first lecture, I'm just going to introduce the topic, what is sex? And really kind of make sure we're both on the same footing so that when I'm talking about sex, it's the same thing that you're talking about, that we're on the same page. And a little bit about how this course is going to work. In this session and lecture and all the lectures to follow, what I'm going to do is start with a little intro like this with me on the camera, and then I'm going to reduce myself and go to my PowerPoint presentation and kind of talk you through. I'll get to different points in the presentation where there's an activity that I'd like you to do, and I'd like you to actually stop the video, get the activity so you have a paper and pencil copy, and actually do it along with me. I'll work you through it. And that's really where you're going to learn the most about, how do I have great sex, is by actually learning the content through doing the activities. I've done all the activities myself. I've pre-tested them with thousands probably of students and clients over the past 20 years. So I know they'll work. I know they'll get you thinking. And at the very least, you'll have a lot of fun and learn a lot about sex. So let me stop talking. Let's get right to the PowerPoint. And then I'll come back at the end and kind of wrap things up. All right, let me reduce myself. And then let's get started. Okay, so you might ask, why do I need to spend time in this lecture defining sex? Everyone knows what sex is, right? Well, maybe. Let me ask you 3 questions. Is oral sex sex? Is masturbation sex? Is anal intercourse sex? Well, 80% of my students and clients don't think that oral sex is sex. Now, I happen to think it is, but again, I'm not assuming based on my age, my experience, my background, that my clients will view things the same way I do. So 80% of my students and clients don't think that oral sex is sex. Let me go to the next slide. 90% of my students and clients don't think that masturbation is sex. And again, I personally think that masturbation is sex, but most of my students and clients don't. And then lastly, more than half of my female students and clients in one cultural group that I work with a lot would still consider themselves virgins after having anal intercourse. All right. So the point isn't whether these beliefs are right or wrong. The point is that you can never assume that your view of sex is shared by your friends, your peers, or even your spouse or your partner. The only way you really know what the people that you're intimate think sex is to talk to them about it. And to do that, you really need to clarify in your own mind what sex really is. And that's why I'm spending the time talking about it. I really want to be sure that I go over all the dimensions of sexuality, give you an opportunity to explore them all, and then move forward and look at how and where you might be stuck in your own sexual relationships. So to start it off and get you kind of feeling a little bit more comfortable about sex, I want to do a fun activity called Sexual Words Brainstorming. So if you haven't gotten it yet, stop the video right now and print it off. But the whole purpose of this activity is to really set the stage for a serious discussion about sex using any words you're comfortable with. Okay, I'm going to use a lot of words that you might not be comfortable with, and that would be a good opportunity to stop and say, that word really kind of is a hot button for me or a red flag. But let's start by just looking at sexual words and playing with them a little bit. All right, so I want you to think of all the names that you can think of for male and female genitalia and different types of sex. So actually make 3 columns right now on your paper: male genitalia, female genitalia, and sex. So whatever, write down all the words, both proper and slang, that you've been exposed to growing up in your culture, and make those 3 separate lists. So I don't care what words you list. I have my favorite word for the male penis that has come up over the years is purple-headed yogurt thrower. I just love that one. And then I guess my favorite for female genitalia is the bearded clam. and I've had everything for sex from banging and fucking and screwing to making love. So let your mind wander, take a few moments and write everything down. And I'm just going to pause and get a drink and give you a few moments to write some of those words down. All right. When you're done doing this, and you can come back to this list, but what I want you to do is, as you're going through the list and you're writing it down, I want you to pay attention to what are your own thoughts about these words and writing them down. And I'm going to define what personal scripts are in another session, but pretty much it's that self-talk and inner dialogue that you have, and your mental images obviously are the pictures in your mind, and then your emotions are your feelings. So as you're writing these words down, what are you thinking? What are you feeling? What are you seeing in your mind when you write down words like purple-headed yogurt thrower, or fuck, or screw, or make love? And then I'd like you to think about, how do your thoughts and your emotions about sexual language contribute to you being stuck in whatever sexual relationship you're in right now? So is your lack of comfort or high level of comfort with sexual talk and sexual vocabulary contributing in some way to you and your partner being stuck? All right, so if you haven't finished, you can come back to this activity and really let your mind go crazy and come up with as many words as possible. And over the course of the training of this course, I'm going to use different words for male and female genitalia and for sex. So it's a good opportunity now to just kind of let your mind free up a little bit. All right. Sex is more than just body parts and behavior, though. It's more than male and female genitalia and, different synonyms for making love. Human sexuality really encompasses all of the components and all of the dimensions of being a sexual creature. And the dimensions of sexuality are, biological, cultural, legal, psychological, social, political, economic, and behavioral. And if you take one issue related to sexuality and look at it, you can see how it is affected by all these dimensions. So if you looked at, birth control or contraception as an example, there's a biological component to birth control. Certain methods work certain ways based on male and female anatomy and physiology and the reproductive cycle. There's a cultural aspect to birth control. Different cultural groups perceive even the whole notion of birth control and planning families differently, and as well as the individual methods. There are social norms about birth control that we see in our institutions and in the media. There are political aspects of birth control, as far as different political groups in power and what they support or they don't support, and then what they push as far as the legal aspects in terms of laws, what's allowed in your city, state, or nation. There are economic factors to birth control related to cost, not only cost to you as a consumer, but development costs to explore new methods and things like that. There are psychological aspects of birth control. I was the condom man or the rubber man for many years, and I worked with the State Health Department in New Jersey in the STD program years and years ago. And I used to give eroticizing condom workshops. And we would talk about, what are your thoughts and feelings about using a condom? I mean, scientifically it works, and we know that, and we know the mechanism of action. But what does it feel like to stop lovemaking, put a condom on, and then pull it off? What's going on in your mind? And then the behavioral, and that's another example of, condom use is a sexual behavior that has, emotional and thinking and other components to it. So if you took any aspect of human sexuality, it could be explored through all of these dimensions. And taken together, these dimensions shape your sexual identity, or how you see yourself as a sexual person right now. And sexual identity is the key variable in the Great Sex on the Inside Out program. So while all the other things are important, I'm really going to focus on sexual identity, because people often get stuck on thoughts and feelings that are related to sexual identity issues. And there are 5 dimensions to sexual identity. In this lecture, I'm going to cover the first one, which is biological sex. And then in the coming lectures, I'll talk about gender and sexual orientation and sexual behavior. And I'd like you to start thinking about all of these dimensions as existing on a continuum. Rather than being this or that, think of them as existing on a continuum, on a scale from 1 to 10. And each of these dimensions of sexual identity can contribute to getting stuck in a sexual rut. Here's what I mean about the continuum. So if you looked at the biological continuum, which we're going to explore in this lecture, you have, genetic, the passing of genetic material, XX and XY chromosome pairings that determine biological maleness and biological femaleness. And then you have some anomalies where either in utero, the fetus or the embryo was exposed to chemicals or the absence of a sex hormone, which should normally be there. And you have intersex people that have the genitalia of both or a partially formed genitalia of their correct biological sex. So you have a spectrum of people on this biological continuum. And this is, of all the continuums, this is the most fixed because, genetic pairing really determines a lot of what happens in terms of sexual anatomy and physiology. The other 3 continuums are much more fluid, and there's much more movement up and down them throughout a person's sexual life. And we're going to talk about the other 3 continuums in the next lectures. And again, I'm presenting biological sex as a sex researcher and scientist, not as someone with a political agenda who's looking to sway the way you view this one way or the other. I'm going to present the anatomical and physiological facts and then let you decide how you want to interpret them. But there's no denying that when egg meets sperm, genetic material is passed, and the result is either an XX chromosomal pairing, which is a genetic biological female, or an XY, which is a genetic biological male. And humans have 23 pairs of chromosomes, and 1 pair determines biological sex. And what this does, it creates, from that moment of conception, continued development of anatomical and physiological differences that make biological men, and biological women, and intersex folks. And these differences that are determined at conception continue throughout your life. Now, the magnitude of the differences and what they, how they limit people or don't limit people, that's all a whole political, economic, psychological discussion that I want to keep out of this lecture for the time being. I just want you to realize that there's no denying that your biological inheritance affects your sexual identity throughout your life in many different ways. Now, there's a process where biological men separate from biological women, and that's called sexual differentiation. And that's where XX and XY chromosome pairings start to differ, start to change. And at birth, or actually, at conception, both male and female sexual anatomical tissue is the same. In other words, if you looked at a very young embryo, if you looked at embryonic tissue before 7 weeks of prenatal development, you would not be able to tell if this is a biological male or a biological female, even though one is XX and one is XY. The tissue looks exactly the same. Now, what has to happen at about 7 weeks prenatal development, there's a hormone that's released in genetic males that actually causes the penis and testicles to continue to develop. There isn't such a hormone in biological females that causes a vagina and vulva and uterus and ovaries to develop. But in biological males, if that hormonal factor is not there, if for some reason there's an anomaly to the chromosomes when they're passed, or there's some kind of exposure to drugs before then that causes this TDF not to be released, a biological male will not grow a penis and will wind up having intersex development, which is somewhere between what looks like a biological female development and a biological male. So my point is, even with a biological male, there needs to be something extra for the continued development of a penis and testicles. And this differentiation happens, is really most notable, I should say, at 3 periods in your development. One is when we just talked about, 7 weeks prenatal. 2 is at puberty, and 3 is at menopause. And at puberty, what happens is the sex gonads, the testes and the ovaries in men and women, really start to exert an influence. Before puberty, if you looked at little boys and little girls, biologically, they're pretty similar. They're pretty similar in height and weight, and physical attributes. And it really isn't until puberty, when testosterone and estrogen and progesterone start to exert their effects, that the shape and size of male and female bodies begins to change. And then at menopause, in biological women, the fertility ceases, whereas in biological men, it doesn't. Now, again, I'm not saying good, bad, what these things are, what they represent in terms of limitations or expectations or whatever. All I'm saying is the reality of biological sex is that at 3 times in a person's life, the influence of male and female genetic pairing and genetic hormones and genetic gonads, ovaries and testes, exerts an influence. How you deal with the influence, how society interprets the influence, is way up for debate, but it does happen. Now, let me talk about similarities and differences, and then we'll start to talk about how you perceive, biological sex and what it means to you. But the similarities between a genetic male and genetic female are, other than the sex chromosomes, both start with the same genetic material. In other words, those other 22 pair of chromosomes we share, they're all the same. Both start with the same lump of embryonic fetal tissue, right, the internal structures. Both are similar in size and strength until puberty. Both change at puberty, and both change in older adulthood. And both produce testosterone. And this is something that a lot of people don't realize, that women produce a small amount of testosterone in their ovaries and adrenal glands, and it is the sexual desire hormone, and it affects sexual desire in women. And men produce it in their testes and adrenal glands. The major difference is that men produce more and need more to have an effect, and women produce less and need less to have a similar effect. But both produce it. So men and women are very similar, as you can see. Now, what are some of the major differences? Well, women have a cyclic hormone release pattern. And you say, well, what the hell does that mean? Well, what it means is, during prenatal development, when the female ovaries are immature, they still release tiny amounts of hormones that affect the brain. And it's literally like pre-wiring of a switchboard. So think of the female brain as a switchboard, and male brain also, but the female brain as a switchboard that has circuits. And these circuits are pre-wired. Now, they're not all used initially, but they're there and they're pre-wired. It's like building a house and you put all the wiring in, and some of the wiring you may not use. So female brains are pre-wired to release hormones in a cyclic pattern. Now, what happens at puberty is this kicks in. So what do you have? You have estrogen and progesterone, which control the menstrual cycle, and they control fertility, kick in. Now, a woman's menstrual period is really the result of a cyclic hormone pattern, that whether it's 28 days, 30 days, 32 days, or even every other month, there's a cycle where the levels of estrogen and progesterone change, resulting in the release of an egg, the ability for that fertilized egg to implant in the uterus. All of that's controlled by a cyclic hormone pattern. Men don't have that. Men's switchboard is wired to have a constant hormone release pattern. So men's hormones are constant. Their level of testosterone is controlled by this little thermostat in the brain, in the pituitary gland, that picks up the level of testosterone in the bloodstream. And if it's too low, it turns the switch on that sends a message to the testes to produce more. But the idea is to keep it constant. Now, what's the big deal? Well, men don't go through a cycle. Men don't menstruate, and men are not able to get pregnant. So, not only do women menstruate, but that whole menstruation cycle is really like the buildup and preparation for, fertilization and implantation, which results in pregnancy. And men simply can't and don't experience that. And I can tell you as a man that, having grown up and spent 66 years on the planet and never having had to think about having a period, or never thinking about carrying a pregnancy, getting pregnant and carrying a pregnancy, that's affected my life differently than my wife and the other women in my life. They have always had to think about that. It's affected, planning. It's affected lots of different things. Now, I've had to think about causing a pregnancy and the results of that, but I have no idea what it would be like to have a period and how that could affect my life. And I have no idea what it would be like to actually have a developing fetus and embryo and child in my body and to give birth. Totally foreign experience. It's hard for me to imagine what that stuff could be like. And then women go through menopause and lose their fertility, and men don't. So again, there's no denying these differences. They exist. Now, what are the implications of this then? Well, the biggest thing for me is that women and men are both similar and different. And the important thing is your perception of the similarities and differences, or your perception of what it means to be a woman or a man and how similar and different men and women are. Is that a factor in you being stuck? And that's the important thing for you, is to look at your thoughts and feelings about what it means to be a man or what it means to be a woman, and look at how you carry these over into your relationship, and whether or not this is something that's causing you to be stuck with your partner. And my biggest thing is the belief that biological sex influences sexual identity, but it doesn't determine it. Just because a woman menstruates doesn't mean that she has to be shut out of certain jobs. Just because a man has testosterone and might be big and masculine and hairy doesn't mean he can't be nurturing or go into a profession where he's a nurturer. So the implications of these differences, that's, where all these social and political and economic things come into play. So how you interpret the differences can be, can vary tremendously, but you can't deny that there are influences based on biology. So to kind of explore this in your own head, I put together a fun activity called Similarities and Differences. The purpose is to really give you a chance, maybe for the first time in your life, to really take a hard look at these similarities and differences and see how they're affecting your own personal sexuality and your relationship. So I'm going to take a moment, get a sip, get that exercise, and then we'll do it together. I have to take a drink of water periodically or I lose my voice. Okay, so we just went over those slides on similarities and differences. Go back and take a look at them again, rewind the video, and then answer the question, do you think that men and women are more similar or different regarding their biological sex? Answer that question. And then again, we're going to get into personal scripts, but basically, what are your thoughts and feelings about your biological sex? And those thoughts, feelings, scripts, and mental images, you're going to see later on, I refer to them as sex programs that your mind runs, because your mind's like a computer. So how do these mind programs, particularly your thoughts and feelings, contribute to you being stuck in a sexual relationship rut? So look at the similarities and differences, think about them, think about how they are playing out now in your mind and in your life, and how they might contribute to you being stuck. Okay. And in the next lecture, we're going to focus on gender identity and gender role. So let me come back. And again, let me emphasize that the way you interpret, the way people interpret, the ways the media, society interprets the differences between men and women and intersex folks who are a combination of the both, the ways, the messages that are sent out about this vary tremendously. And I want to emphasize the point that it's up to you to determine what you think about these similarities and differences. But there is no denying that because of XX and XY chromosome pairings, genetic material past that conception, biological men are different than biological women. And how that plays out in your life may be a contributing factor right now to being stuck. And that's how I want you to look at it. I don't want you to put, because I don't put any moral, ethical, good, bad, right, wrong judgments on this stuff. It's just, is it helping me get to where I want to be in my personal sexuality and my sexual relationship? Or are my thoughts and feelings about my biological sex contributing to me being stuck? That's the key thing. And throughout this training program, I keep coming back to, okay, taking a look at all the objective information about sexuality. Is this stuff helping me? Are my thoughts and feelings helping me get to where I want to be the sexual person I want to be? Or are they contributing to being stuck? And that's the key. The whole second half of the training focuses on helping you get unstuck. The first half starts with looking at what's contributing to you being stuck. All right. I hope you enjoyed this first lecture on sexuality. Got 4 more to come. I'm going to get myself out of here and end this meeting, and I'll see you around on the next meeting.